Radio silence at 7,134 meters on Peak Lenin. 8 women's voices gone quiet. The arithmetic was simple. Minus 40 degrees, 100 miles per hour winds. No margin for error. At that altitude, the air holds just a third of the oxygen found at sea level. Every breath becomes a calculation against time. Every decision carries the weight of 8 lives. Rewind to July 1974. The Cold War was shifting toward détente, but in the remote Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, another kind of competition was unfolding. A massive international mountaineering meet brought together 170 climbers from 10 countries. Among them, a Soviet women's team attempting something unprecedented, the first traverse of Peak Lenin. What happened next became one of mountaineering's most buried tragedies. Elvira Shatayeva stood on a boulder in the Pamir base camp, blue eyes blazing, ordering 4 Soviet men around her like pieces on a chessboard. When American climber Molly Higgins first saw her, the impression was immediate and lasting. Shatayeva identified herself as master of sport and challenged others to do the same. Master of sport. In the status-conscious Soviet Union, this was the highest credential in any discipline. For a woman to achieve it in mountaineering made the accomplishment even more extraordinary. Shatayeva had already led the first all-women's ascent of Peak Korzenievskaya at 7,105 meters in 1972. She'd guided a traverse of the double-summited Ushba in Georgia. At 35, she commanded respect through competence, not politics. But politics surrounded everything in 1974. The International Mountaineering Meet was designed to showcase Soviet climbing prowess to Western rivals. 170 climbers from 10 countries occupied the massive base camp, with another 60 Eastern European and Russian climbers positioned strategically across a stream. The Americans had never been allowed to climb in the Soviet Union before. Every ascent carried weight beyond personal achievement. Shatayeva's team represented 8 of the Soviet Union's most elite women climbers, aged 22 to 35. They operated as what her husband Vladimir later described as a disciplined yet congenial unit. No arguments, no dissent. Their meetings, Elvira told him, displayed an openness that men had never dreamed of. Yet this unity masked enormous pressure. Most Soviet men believed a women's team would never succeed on the 23,406-foot Peak Lenin. The objective they'd chosen made success even more unlikely. Not just a summit, but a complete traverse. Up the technical Lipkin Ridge on the northeast face, bivouac on the exposed summit, then descend the northwest ridge toward Razdelny Peak. No team, male or female, had ever completed this route. The equipment disparity was stark. American and European climbers carried nylon tents with aluminum poles and reliable zippers. The Soviet women had canvas tents with wooden poles and toggle closures that would fail in high winds. Their boots featured metal nails instead of modern crampon systems. While Western teams used advanced weather radios, the Soviets relied on weak, borrowed communication equipment. American climber Arlene Bloom noticed the technological gap immediately, remarking that Russian technology seemed more focused on space than on the mountains. When Bloom suggested the American and Soviet women's teams climb together, Shatayeva rejected the idea. The reason was clear. The first women's team to succeed on Peak Lenin had to be Soviet, not Western. National pride demanded it. Shatayeva asserted that Soviet women were strong, emphasized collective spirit, and expressed confidence in success. The plan was ambitious to the point of recklessness. The Lipkin Ridge presented technical ice climbing at extreme altitude. The summit bivouac would expose them to the worst weather the mountain could deliver. The northwest ridge descent was largely unknown terrain. But ambition matched the political stakes. American climber Jed Williamson visited their camp 2 nights before departure. In a country governed by rigid regulations, this expedition marked something unprecedented. Soviet women operating without male supervision for the first time. 4 of the 8 had previously climbed Peak Lenin, but always with men leading. The women sang songs together in the evenings. Their laughter, as American Deputy Leader Bob Craig noted, would tinkle like bells across the valley. They performed morning calisthenics in formation outside their tents. Everything appeared disciplined, prepared, confident, but confidence couldn't change the hard arithmetic of high-altitude survival. Peak Lenin wasn't considered technically difficult, but it was massive, remote, and subject to sudden, violent weather. The traverse plan put them at maximum exposure during the most dangerous phase of any climb, the descent. On July 30th, Shatayeva's team departed base camp for their assault on Peak Lenin. The international climbing community watched. Political reputations hung in the balance. 8 women carried the weight of Soviet mountaineering credibility up the Lipkin Ridge, unaware that the worst storm in 25 years was already forming in the west. August 4th arrived with deceptive calm. The women had been climbing steadily for 5 days, moving up the Lipkin Ridge without major incident. At base camp, meteorologists tracked a massive low-pressure system approaching from the west. Vitaly Abalakov, master of sport for mountaineering in the entire Soviet Union, issued clear orders for all climbers to descend immediately. The message never reached Shatayeva's team. Their borrowed Soviet radio was weak and unreliable. Different national teams operated on separate frequencies, a communication failure that would prove catastrophic. While other climbers received the warning and began retreating, 8 women continued climbing toward the summit, unaware of the approaching disaster. Richard North, a biomedical scientist from Scotland, was descending alone after his summit attempt when he encountered them. The visibility had dropped to mere meters. Wind was building, but the women moved upward in formation, determined and focused. North tried to inject humor about shortness of breath at altitude. The team replied with confidence about their strength and identity as women. Those were the last words any outsider would hear from them while they were still mobile. North continued his descent, joining Soviet climbers who had summited behind him. He believed the women would climb the steep, icy section above and bivouac on the eastern edge of the summit ridge before moving to the actual summit the next day. Meanwhile, on the more straightforward Razdelny side of the mountain, other climbers were receiving evacuation orders. A Soviet climber approached American Arlene Bloom's tent at Camp 3 with an urgent message from base warning of an approaching storm and advising against climbing. The air remained deceptively calm. Visibility was reasonable. Many climbers had traveled thousands of miles for this opportunity and were positioned for summit attempts. Some chose to ignore the warnings and continue upward. Others, including Bloom and American climber Jed Williamson, started for the summit but maintained strict turnaround times, watching the western horizon with growing concern. When the storm hit shortly before noon on August 5th, it struck with the violence that only high-altitude weather can deliver. Bloom, nearing the summit, immediately began retreating, soon fighting winds that threatened to tear her from the mountain. Williamson, who had reached the summit plateau at 22,800 feet, also turned back, breaking trail through the developing whiteout to help guide Bloom down. Higher on the mountain, Shatayeva's team had reached the summit late that afternoon, carrying full loads for their planned traverse. At 5 p.m., they radioed base camp. In the deteriorating visibility, they reported difficulty identifying their descent route and decided to set up tents to wait for improved conditions. Base camp agreed with the decision. Abalakov told them to descend immediately if possible, or wait through the night and begin descent at first light. The women were experienced. Their leader was master of sport. The decision seemed reasonable. It was a fatal miscalculation. That night, as temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, winds reached 70 to 80 miles per hour. The Soviet women's canvas tents with toggle closures began failing immediately. 2 tents were destroyed completely during the first night, forcing the team to crowd into the remaining shelters. Lower on the mountain, American climbers Alan Steck, Christopher Wren, and Jock Glidden huddled in their Camp 4 at 22,000 feet. Their nylon tent with aluminum poles held, though one pole snapped under the pressure. They wore boots and all clothing to bed, prepared for their shelter to disintegrate. The contrast in equipment quality was becoming a matter of life and death. While the Americans' modern gear barely survived, the Soviet women's World War II-era canvas tents were shredding in the hurricane-force winds. On the exposed summit, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The women attempted to descend on August 6th, but managed only a few hundred feet before conditions forced them to stop. The granular, wind-packed snow was too hard for digging proper snow caves. They were trapped on a narrow ridge with inadequate shelter, fighting a storm that meteorologists would later classify as the worst in the region in 25 years. As the women struggled to survive their second night above 23,000 feet, Irina Lyubimtseva died. She froze to death while holding a safety rope, maintaining her grip to protect her teammates, even as hypothermia claimed her life. The radio logs from August 6th and 7th document a systematic collapse that unfolded in real time. At base camp, climbers gathered around the communication equipment as translators relayed each transmission from the summit. What they heard was the methodical destruction of 8 lives by forces beyond human control. Around 5 p.m. on August 6th, Shadayeva reported that one woman had become ill and another seemed unwell. The storm had been battering them for over 24 hours. Abalakov urged an immediate descent and emphasized reaching snow suitable for digging caves, implying that if adequate shelter could not be achieved, and a climber could not, the group might have to leave her for the survival of the whole team. Shatayeva's team refused to abandon anyone. As they attempted descent, moving only several hundred feet below the summit, Nina Vasilyeva and Valentina Fateyeva began showing severe symptoms of altitude sickness and exposure. The combination of hypoxia and hypothermia was shutting down their body's core functions. The hard, granular snow defeated every attempt to dig protective caves. Wind scoured and frozen solid, it turned their ice axes aside like concrete. The women managed to erect 2 tents on the narrow ridge, but the shelters provided minimal protection against winds that now reached hurricane force. August 7th brought no relief. At approximately 8 a.m., Abalakov pressed for an update. Shatayeva replied that 3 more were sick. Only 2 were still functioning, and both were weakening, adding that they would not leave their comrades after all that had been done. The loyalty that had made them an effective climbing team was now sealing their fate. In Western mountaineering culture, the decision to leave dying teammates might be agonizing, but survivable. For these Soviet women, abandoning comrades violated everything they had been taught about collective responsibility. By 10 a.m., Shatayeva said the place felt very sad, where it had once been beautiful. The summit of Peak Lenin, which had represented the pinnacle of their mountaineering careers, had become a frozen graveyard. The same winds that carved the mountain's dramatic ridges were now tearing apart their remaining shelters and scattering their survival equipment across the glacier. By noon, the situation had deteriorated further. Nina Vasilyeva and Valentina Fateyeva had died from the combined effects of exposure and altitude. One more teammate was dying. A transmission described a final question from one of the women about when they would see flowers again, and earlier concerns about children, followed by the realization that none of it would matter now. The question about flowers revealed the psychological toll of prolonged exposure to the death zone. At extreme altitude, the brain begins shutting down non-essential functions. Hallucinations are common, but this was a dying woman's final grasp at the beauty and warmth of the world below. At 3:30 p.m., a transmission acknowledged failure, effort, and overwhelming cold. Abalakov, listening in despair at base camp, promised that rescue was underway. But everyone understood the mathematics of high-altitude rescue. No helicopter could reach the summit in these winds. No ground team could climb through the storm. The women were beyond human help. At 5 p.m., another update indicated another death. Summit temperatures were estimated at -30 to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds exceeded 80 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 100. 3 women remained alive, huddled in collapsed tent fabric with inadequate sleeping bags. By 6:30 p.m., another death was reported. The survivors stated they could not endure another night and lacked the strength even to hold down the transmitter button. Hurricane-force winds had exploded their remaining tents, scattering stoves, rucksacks, and mittens across the summit ridge. 5 women were crowding into a single collapsed shelter with only 3 sleeping bags between them. The arithmetic of survival had become impossible. At 8:30 p.m. on August 7th, the final coherent transmission indicated that only 2 remained and that death was imminent, coupled with an apology, an acknowledgement of effort, a plea for forgiveness, and a farewell. Vladimir Shataev's memoir suggests the final speaker may have been Galina Perehodiuk, not Elvira. The exact words were difficult to understand through the storm interference, but the meaning was unmistakable. Twice more, someone pressed the radio button. No words came through, only the sound of wind and static. Then silence. August 8th dawned clear and brutally cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind crystalline visibility and temperatures that preserved everything in place like a frozen crime scene. Alan Steck, Christopher Wren, and Jock Glidden climbed toward the summit, unaware of the tragedy that awaited them above. Steck saw the first body on the face below the summit, a blue jacket against white snow. Wren recognized Elvira Shataeva immediately, her features preserved by the sub-zero temperatures. Signs of others were visible upslope, dark shapes scattered across the summit ridge. 4 Japanese climbers arrived simultaneously, and the Americans used their more powerful radio to contact base camp. Steck reported that something very strange and very sad had occurred. The scene defied comprehension. Tent fabric hung in shreds from wooden pole fragments scattered across the summit. 8 women lay frozen in their final positions, some half buried in snow, others sprawled across a torn tent platform that had been pitched on a scooped-out snow shelf. One woman still gripped a rope that led downhill, her frozen hands maintaining a belay that might have saved others. 3 were found together, having died while trying to maintain their collapsed shelter. The 8th would be discovered beneath the others when Vladimir Shataev and a support crew retrieved the bodies a week later. The Americans walked among the dead, crying openly. The scattered gear told the story of the storm's violence. Stoves blown hundreds of feet away, sleeping bags shredded by wind, wooden tent poles snapped like kindling. Everything pointed to the inadequacy of 1940s-era equipment against modern mountain weather. That night at their camp, all 3 Americans reported hearing women's voices carried on the wind and repeatedly checked outside their tent to find no one there. The helicopter retrieval operation a week later was conducted with military precision and minimal publicity. Vladimir Shataev, himself a master of sport climber, personally recovered his wife's body and those of her teammates. The Soviet authorities treated the recovery as a logistical exercise, not a national tragedy. Official reports minimized the disaster's significance. The focus shifted quickly to other expedition deaths. American John Gary Ullen, killed in an avalanche, and Swiss climber Eva Eisenschmidt, who died in the same storm system. The 8 Soviet women became a footnote in expedition summaries, their deaths attributed to severe weather conditions without analysis of systemic failures. The international climbing community, still navigating Cold War sensitivities, largely accepted the official narrative. Western climbers who witnessed the aftermath were discouraged from detailed public accounts. The story faded from mountaineering literature, buried beneath political considerations and the Soviet Union's institutional reluctance to acknowledge failure. Within a decade, the tragedy had been effectively erased from climbing history. No memorials were built, no safety protocols were revised. The lessons that might have prevented future disasters were lost along with the 8 women who died learning them. Subscribe for more untold stories from mountaineering's buried history.